Hey, it's Jordan. Delighted to be joined by Seattle City Council member and proud socialist, Kshama Sawant. Thought it would be great to speak with you, not only because Seattle has been under federal oversight for police brutality and misconduct for years, but you're taking action, proposing legislation there to ban tear gas and other police militarization. Can you kind of talk about what you're proposing and what have been the conditions for Seattle? Many people think of Seattle as some liberal utopia, but the police there have been barbaric for many, many years, and that's why, in part, we're seeing such large protests there in addition to the rest of the country.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for having me, Jordan. And as you were alluding to, there is a nationwide rebellion and indeed a global rebellion of young people that has been triggered most immediately by the George Floyd murder at the hands of the Minneapolis police, but it reflects deep frustration and anger with the overall conditions that are, or the society that is put forward on the basis of capitalism, where young people have no future. And on top of that, you have seen cities like Seattle, and I'll come to Seattle specifically in a second, but cities like Seattle, which have had a long, decades-long track record of, as you said, barbaric behavior by the police departments, but especially all of this happening under the watch of Democratic Party establishments in many of these cities, and that kind of police violence and brutality going hand in hand, and not coincidental, but sort of going hand in hand with the deep inequality and fissures in our very class-based society, where billionaires are making money hand over fist, and entire generations are collapsing in terms of their, the kind of economic devastation they face. So that's the kind of situation that Seattle has been in for the last decade. There's been an economic boom, and yet there has been massive gentrification of the Black and brown working class community being pushed out of the city, and rents skyrocketing, really a bleak future for young people. And in that context, massive brutality by the police. And as you correctly said, since 2012, the Seattle Police Department has been under federal oversight through a U.S. Department of Justice consent decree. And that consent decree itself was a product of grassroots organizing by Native and Black community working class activists really fighting to put that in place. And so fast forward 2020, George Floyd is brutally murdered while saying, "I can't breathe," and calling out for his mother in Minneapolis. And you have all these protests breaking out like in the city of Seattle. And look at the tragic irony under capitalism, that protests by families with children, working class people, workers, labor movement people, going out and protesting police brutality and violence and being met with police brutality and violence. That is the situation we are in. And in Seattle, we have seen, since Saturday, we have seen indiscriminate use of tear gas, mace, pepper spray, rubber bullets. There were also flashbang grenades and blast balls being used. Medics and members of the media have been injured as well. And I was myself for many hours outside in Seattle downtown on Saturday at the main protest, the first main protest. And I personally witnessed much of this just completely unacceptable misconduct. And that's why I'm bringing forward a bill. Right now, my office is drafting a bill to ban police use and purchase of any kind of chemical weapons, including tear gas, mace, and pepper spray. Also other weapons like rubber bullets, like blast balls, like sonic and ultrasonic weapons. I'm also bringing forward another bill to ban chokeholds by the police.
And I want to ask you about the broader psychology of this, because I see many mayors, particularly Democratic mayors and governors, there's almost this like fetishizing of the police. I'm not saying all police are terrible, but, Mayor Bill de Blasio is asked questions by journalists about brutality they're witnessing, and he says, well, the police commissioner told me otherwise. Mayor Durgan, a couple days ago in Seattle, when asked why are body cameras not on when police are macing children, she came up with some, backwards statement about, well, we don't want to surveil people, that's why the body cameras were off. It seems like in this over deference to police who work for us, Democratic mayors, Republicans too, are very afraid to criticize the police, go against the police. Why do you think that is?
That's a very important point, Jordan. And if I might, I just wanted to start by laying out the larger context. The most, look at the kind of dangerous and horrific rhetoric coming from the Trump administration. One of his tweets, as I'm sure many of your viewers saw, where it said, when the looting begins, the shooting begins. Absolutely horrific declaration of, further militarizing the police in the face of determined protests. And in the context of Donald Trump being in the White House with right-wing and dangerous racist and bigoted ideologies being emboldened, in that context especially, it is dramatically problematic, the kind of approach that the Democratic establishments in these various cities have taken. And the mayor of Seattle, for example, and you see this in different cities as well, shedding, and I don't mean just the mayor, I also want to mention the city council. We saw this display from many of the city council members as well, who are, most of whom are Democratic establishment council members. I'm the only socialist in City Hall. Many of them repeatedly shedding crocodile tears over George Floyd, even going so far as to joining the movement saying, yes, George Floyd was a murder. But what about the murders that have happened in Seattle? Since 2011, 30 people have been killed. They have been murdered by the police department, and that has happened under the watch of repeated administrations of the Democratic Party establishment. And as to why this is happening, I think it really goes to the heart of the nature of the capitalist system itself. When you have a system that is fundamentally meant to be deeply unequal, in that kind of deep inequality, it is inevitable that that state that wants to control a whole population that is deeply frustrated and angered by the status quo, in order to control and stem that anger, keep all the bubbling under the surface, more and more that kind of state, the capitalist state, needs to rely on violence and brutality and repressive measures by the arms of that state. And the police, of course, are one of the major components of that kind of arm. The military, of course, plays another role in the international context of capitalism. But you see the repressive measures, the racist practices, the anti-poor approach of the police department targeting homeless neighbors. All of this, none of this is happening just because a given individual is bad. Obviously, we have police departments now becoming hotbeds for reactionary and right-wing ideologies, but it's not happening in a vacuum. It's happening in the context of where the state needs to increasingly deploy these kinds of repressive measures to maintain a status quo that is increasingly unacceptable to the vast majority of population. Especially the millennial generation is absolutely chafing at the status quo and wants something different. And that's what we are seeing breaking out nationwide. And that's why I think what a very important message to our movement is, we cannot rely on the same establishment that got us here in the first place. Our movements have to be independent of corporate politicians and the Democratic and Republican Party establishments. That means we need leadership in the movement that is not connected to that establishment and that's not beholden to that establishment. So we need to hold movement leaders accountable as well.
I'd like to ask you, obviously you've been on the forefront in the fight against Amazon, or at least to force Amazon to be a responsible corporate citizen. We're getting lip service from Amazon and other corporations right now. Amazon came out with a message of solidarity with the black community, so did Starbucks, others. But as this movement unfolds, obviously it's about police brutality and the senseless, barbaric murder of unarmed black men. But there's economic violence too that is involved with this, and Amazon's part of that. Fast food chains, Walmart, et cetera, et cetera. Do you want to see that of this movement evolve into that? Because frankly, you do not see these types of things happening in upper middle class white neighborhoods because economically the oligarchy thrives off of that class.
No, that's a very, very important point. And in fact, it's not just you and me, but in fact, in broadly in the movement, the rank and file of the movement, the young people who are genuinely angry about police murders and want an answer to the racial injustice, they are connecting the dots and they understand that very much the police state is very much a part of a state that continues to inflict economic misery on the vast majority of people. And let's keep in mind, these protests, this new protest movement, this new uprising has broken out in the context of a global pandemic and a recession that has almost overnight has inflicted devastation on vast numbers of people. We have seen already 40 million people, almost 40 million people saying that they're unemployed and they're jobless. And who do you think is the most disproportionately impacted by deaths in the pandemic and also the economic consequences of the recession? It's the same communities that also face the brunt of the police violence and sometimes exclusively face. And so you're right. So in wealthier neighborhoods, you don't see this kind of police crackdown and you don't see any police presence either. But that's not because they are behaving better, those people are behaving better, and because people in the black communities are not behaving well. It has precisely everything to do with the economic injustice that goes hand in hand with capitalism, with racial injustice. And in fact, as Malcolm X said, you can't have capitalism without racism. So racism itself is very much an intentional and deliberate product of a system that has to maintain economic inequality, because the whole purpose of the capitalist system is to maximize wealth for a sliver at the top at the expense of the rest of us. So, just to give you an example of how much openness there is in the movement to making this connection between racial injustice and economic injustice, as you know, we are fighting to tax Amazon and other big businesses. And I have put forward a legislation for the city council, which they have managed to bring up all kinds of legal excuses to delay the vote. Now they are out of those excuses, so they're going to have to vote one way or another. But we're not relying on the Democratic establishment. We have a ballot initiative that ordinary people, that activists in the community are collecting signatures for, and it was incredible to see the results. We collected almost 1,500 signatures in one day of the protest action, just in a few hours, with a few dozen people collecting signatures, because people are hungry for this kind of action, and they understand that all the actions like banning chemical weapons and banning chokeholds have to go with actually addressing the deeper questions in society. And so there's a huge openness to tax big business, to fund social housing and jobs. And furthermore, the other thing that we're going to be fighting on is a demand that has come from these community protests, which is to cut the Seattle police budget in half and use those funds to fund restorative justice.
And do you, that proposal is going on all over the country. Listen, you talk a lot about the only way out of this economic inequality is a resurgence of the labor movement, but then there's bad labor too, police unions, who frankly are not exactly of the spirit of, the vibrant labor movement of decades ago. Some might say it's a coordinated gang, some of these police unions, and politicians are taking a lot of money from these police unions. How do you see that happening in terms of even putting a dent in these police departments with such powerful unions behind them, and obviously, our federal government, who has rarely taken a side against police departments?
I'm so glad you raised this extremely critical question, Jordan. And I want your viewers to know that I'm speaking not only as a socialist, as an elected representative of Seattle's working people, but I'm also speaking as a rank and file member of the labor movement myself. I'm a member of the American Federation of Teachers, Local 1789. I'm a member of the local AFL-CIO, and I could not agree more about the historic role that the labor movement now needs to play, without which we are not going to win the kind of victories we need to win, and not just win the reforms, but point towards a different system than capitalism itself. That's not going to happen without tenacious and sustained workplace actions going hand in hand with community protests, and without the labor movement taking on the question of racial injustice. And so what we are seeing right now is the rebellion that is going on in society is forcing even some of the most conservative layers in the labor leadership to contend with the mistakes that they have made in the past, and absolutely terrible mistakes. So to put it more concretely, just to give you an example, as you might remember, about a year and a half, 2 years ago, the Police Officers Guild, the Seattle Police Officers Guild contract came up for a vote on the city council, because the city council votes on it. And it was a bad contract in the sense that it was going to pull back some of the hard-fought and actually, to be honest, quite modest accountability measures that had been won through mass movements and community organizing. And at that time, not only was I the only no vote on it, and the mayor and the rest of the city council was gung-ho about it, but at the same time, as you were saying, the sections of the labor leadership played a bad role in really rooting for that contract, making it a labor issue, and issuing threats against me, saying, one of the leaders in the labor movement issued a public threat against me saying, any council member who dares to vote against this contract, we are coming after them next year in the re-election. And they did. As you know, a conservative section of the labor leadership stood against me in the primary election last year. But the counter to that has been provided by the progressive and left-wing unions, who themselves stood against the the police contract 2 years ago, stood with me on the no vote, issued a public statement saying, the reason we oppose this is not because we don't believe that the police should not have their living standards, raises, and so on, which we support, of course, but the problem is that as long as you allow the police to carry out repression and brutality and violence against other workers, this has got to be taken up by the labor movement, because an injury to one is an injury to all. And so it is really important to note that rank and file members of the labor movement themselves are pushing back against this bad idea of standing with the police unions on brutality and racism. So again, concretely, as you might have heard, a bus driver in Minneapolis who's a member of the ATU 1005 there, Adam Birch, who's also a member of my organization, Socialist Alternative, he immediately issued a statement on Facebook and social media saying, I refuse to bus protesters to jail. And that really took off among his co-workers and his fellow members. And that led to the ATU International issuing a very important statement in solidarity with the protests and saying, we're not going to bus the protesters to jail. Minneapolis nurses issued a statement. Minneapolis teachers issued a statement. And in Seattle, we have hundreds of rank and file workers really pushing for that. And last but not least, all this pressure is forcing the leaders who have made bad decisions and have, which has gone hand in hand with their business unionism. So that's not coincidental. The same union leaders who opposed our Amazon tax are also the same leaders who were gung-ho about this police contract. And they're being forced to contend with their own members, rank and file members, opposing their support for a racist police department. And so now the executive board of the local labor council, the local AFL-CIO, has passed a motion where they are demanding that the Police Officers Guild make some serious changes or face being disaffiliated with the Labor Council. And I think this is a long time coming, and this is crucial. And then, and also I'll mention that, this is how dangerous this is. And as you were drawing in your question, Jordan, it's very important, obviously, to call out the abdication of responsibility by business union leaders who have who have been an obstacle to the labor movement actually fighting back against economic injustice and racial injustice, but also their ties to the establishment. And it's not just the democratic establishment we're talking about. We're talking about something really dangerous. The Fraternal Order of the Police nationally, which many of these police unions are affiliated with, has openly been reactionary, right-wing, racist, bigoted, and proud Trump supporters. So we're talking about extremely dangerous reactionaries that we have to fight against. And the best way to do that is to unify the community protests with the labor movement, fighting together, hand in hand, against racial and economic injustice.
Hope you enjoyed that last video. Hop on over to statuscoup.com where you can sign up for our email list and become a member for as low as $5 to $10 a month. Membership is how we grow. That's statuscoup.com/join. And remember, join our email list so we can grow the revolution with you.